Hi everyone, welcome to the second online lecture by global experts on care economy by Dr. Janine Anderson, who will speak about understanding caretaking systems and predictability, emotions and exchange. My name is Clemencia Muñoz Tamayo and I'm the Chief of the UN Women Training Center. This online lecture is part of the moderated course on care economy run by the UN Women Training Center from 27 October to 19 December. There will be 7 online lectures throughout the course. Lectures will be delivered by global renowned experts in this field. Online lectures provide course participants with a distinguished opportunity to listen to, learn from, and ask experts. I hope you fully take advantage of these opportunities. These lectures will enrich your knowledge on care economy as well as your learning experience with the moderated course. Let me now introduce you to the course moderator, Dr. Amaya Perez Orozco, and our speaker for today, Dr. Janine Anderson. Dr. Amaya Perez Orozco holds a PhD in International Economics and Development and is an expert on public equality policies. She has broad training experience in formal education programs and professional ongoing training. She has also a wide policy-oriented research experience within the academia and for international institutions, and has been collaborated with UN Women since 2007 in both training and policy-oriented research on the following topics: gender, development and migration, gender economics and the care economy, and global CareAn. She has several publications, including books, chapters, and articles. She has been a guest speaker in numerous events in the academia, government institutions, and civil society. Among her publications with UN Women, we include Embodied Inequalities, Global Care Chains, Domestic Work and Political Articulation, and Global Care Chains Towards a Rights-Based Global Care Regime. Dr. Amaya Perez Orozco is the moderator of the course as well as the moderator of the online lectures. Dr. Janine Anderson holds a PhD in anthropology, Cornell University, New York. She was born in the US and has been a resident in Peru since the 1970s and a Peruvian citizen since 1976. She has worked for the Ministry of Education of Peru, the Ford Foundation Regional Office, various women's organizations, and as an independent researcher and consultant as well. From 1992 to 2012, she taught anthropology and gender studies at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Her regular courses involved research methodology, urban anthropology, complex societies, the anthropology of health and environment, and gender, culture, and public policy. Her recent research experiences have focused on Peruvian women in international migration and global care chains, child domestic service, intercultural issues involving health system and services, and childhood in the Andes and the Amazonian region of Peru. Her longest term effort, and one that has been personally most compelling, is a longitudinal study of urban poverty in Lima, where she has followed a group of families in what began as a shanty town from the 70s to the present. Bibliography includes 2012, La migración femenina en las cadenas globales del cuidado en Chile y España, Feminine Migration in Peru and the Global Care Chains in Chile and Spain, with UN Women, in 2010, Uncommensurable Worlds of Practice and Value, The View from the Shanty Town, in Gutenberg and Paul and Regadas Luis editors, Indelible Inequalities in Latin America, North Carolina Duke University Press, Urban Poverty Reborn, A Gender and Generational Analysis, in Polakov, Erica, and Lincoln McGovern Ligaya editors, Gender and Globalization, Patterns of Women Resistance, Dissiter Publications. I would like to remind you that we will have around 20 minutes after the presentation to ask questions. To fully benefit Dr. Anderson's time today, let's focus your question on her presentations. If you have questions about the course content and structure, please contact Amaya, the course moderator. If you have questions about the e-learning campus, please contact Leslie, the e-learning specialist. And if you have questions about the course and overall, please contact Cam, the course coordinator. Lastly, please ensure that you attend the online lectures. Without further ado, let me hand this over to Amaya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clemencia, for your opening of this second online lecture, and welcome everyone. We are now in this second online lecture, which corresponds to session 2, identifying care needs and care providers. This session 2 will run for this whole second week, so till next Sunday. And as you already know, this session addresses the way societies organize the provision of the care they need and the care systems that result from this organization. In this session, we will discuss the general and specific care needs present in each society, and we will also discuss the different scenarios that might contribute to the provision of care, that is the state, the market, the community, and households. Janine, as Clemencia said, is an anthropologist, so she will approach the issue of care from a slightly different standpoint than Francisco did. Francisco is an economist, so Janine's point of view is really enriching for this course, and the topics that she is going to address today with us are not discussed in the reading paper, or at least not discussed in such depth as she will do today. So we really think that this lecture is going to be very fruitful for all of us, and will provide us insights that we cannot find in the, as I mentioned, in the reading paper. So please listen carefully to her, and we will have, as you know, first her presentation sorry, my presentation, yeah, okay, now. So first Janine will deliver her lecture for about 30 minutes, 25-30 minutes, and then we will have a questions and answers session. Finally, we will make a brief wrap-up, but before giving the floor to Janine, please let me explain you the basics of the GoToWebinar. As you can see, there's a blue button that allows you to view the presentation in full screen mode. So you just have to click there. If the console is in the way of the presentation, you can dock it by clicking the orange arrow just above it. And if it is docked, to see the whole console, simply click on the orange arrow again. As in the past lecture, the main way of taking part and of interacting today for you, for all the participants, will be to ask Janine any question by typing it. So please note the questions section at the bottom area of the webinar console. Then you must click on the plus to ensure the questions are visible, and a box will appear where you can type in your questions at any time during the online lecture. So with no further delay, I just give the floor to Janine. Janine, please go ahead with this really interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clemencia and Amaya. I am very pleased to be with all of you today, and I think that this is this course is a wonderful initiative on the part of UN Women. Obviously, there are innumerable things that could be said about understanding caretaking systems, and that's going to be one of my principal arguments here, that these are extremely complex systems. So I will only be able to cover some of the facets that have been particularly interesting to me, or that I have had occasion to see through my research and simply participating in the Peruvian Society or Latin American societies of which I am a member. Yeah, so if we could see the next slide. Next slide, please. Just a brief review. Why are these so important systems of caretaking so invisible in most of the debates within the social and economic sciences and within policy making. And I think that now there are some obvious reasons why this is so that are probably familiar to all of us, that have to do with the fact that most of these debates have been conducted by men. I think that the fact that they have come from disciplines that excluded, for example, social work, or what used to be called home economics and now tends to be called human ecology, I think that's also very important. These are, after all, the disciplines that were closest to households over the years and to examining the way households resolved issues around caring and provisioning. So I think also that there's a tendency to sort of feel that, wow, problems of caring are fixing themselves. If we see something that looks like a crisis of care, we can always call it an economic crisis or an employment crisis, or it can be renamed as something else. And then, a very important issue, the demographic groups and categories of dependence, such as children or the elderly or problems of disabilities. These are demographic cohorts that are just now beginning to be studied with their own journals and their own even courses, and in some cases PhD programs. Next slide, please. Some of the reasons why caretaking systems are invisible or have been invisible are not so obvious. And one of them is that caring activities are extremely complicated. And I think that the reaction of many people, especially those that don't do much caring or housekeeping, is a reaction of just, oh, this is so boring. And but another reason, caring is intimately related to morality and moral norms. So it comes very close to questions of religion and value. There are important cultural differences in people's understandings of how much care should be provided, under what circumstances, and when care should be denied or withheld. And I think this produces a lot of nervousness in societies where there is a sense that cultural pluralism is the prevailing ethos, that these are secular societies that respect differences, so they even lack a language and channels of communication to talk about religion and morality and values. So this session, in effect, has as one of its objectives that of simply complicating our thinking about care and caretaking. Learning always involves making things more complicated, so I won't apologize any further for having taking this tack. Next slide, please. Systems of caretaking, and the emphasis is on the idea of systems. So the concept of caretaking systems, I think we have to put it in the same box as the way we talk about political systems or economic systems or educational systems or language systems, which exist in all societies and organize a large number of very disparate elements into a semi-coordinated whole. These are loosely coupled systems in sociological jargon, and yet they must be sufficiently coordinated so that they make some reasonably efficient use of resources. They must be grounded in some broad consensus among the members of the society about what's going on here and what does this mean and what are we trying to achieve. And they must be cognitively and emotionally consistent to the degree that they can be taught to children. After all, children have to be inducted into a system of care, not only as receivers of care, but as providers of care eventually. So each society can be said to have its own philosophy or culture of care. Next slide, please. At the same time, these are systems that are permanently under dispute. They're full of conflict and full of arguments about what's happening and what should be happening. So in some societies, we may find a tightly organized set of practices, beliefs, roles, norms, and institutions that leave little room for individual variation, or that for those that can't quite fit into the system, there are extreme sanctions and punishments. In other societies, the system may contain apparent inconsistencies, options, choices, even confusions over what should be done and who should do it. So there we have the large culturally diverse societies of contemporary megacities, for example, where different systems of caring can coexist side by side in parallel and even compete as ways of organizing care. Of course, this doesn't prevent a lot of gossip and commentary about how well or how poorly everybody is performing their role. And I think that we see this whenever we're on a city bus somewhere and looking out the window and see some failure of care on the sidewalk, and suddenly everyone inside the bus is activated to make some comment about what's the fault of the person that they're observing. Next slide, please. Or, there's a picture. Hello? Next slide.
Hello, sorry, I don't know what happened. I will try to get the slides back.
Uh-huh.
Leslie, could you please help? I cannot show the screen. Sorry, Janine, for that.
It's okay.
Okay, sure. We'll take care of this in a second. Sorry to audience members. Yeah, let me make you the presenter. Bear with us just for a second. Okay, Maya, does it give you the option to share now?
No, it doesn't give me the option to share.
Okay.
It was a picture, so maybe it was too heavy or too... We could just skip it.
We'll just be one more second here. Okay, so Maya, do you have any kind of a little box on your screen that says you have become the presenter again and you may share? What I'll do is
I'm trying to become the silent presenter, but I can't.
Okay, I'll take it for a second and then I'll try to give it back to you.
Yes, please.
Okay? So, any luck? Have you seen it? Not yet? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I guess I'm going to have to, I'll try to take over the screen sharing because for some reason it's, Maya, you don't see any box at all saying that you should be the presenter, right? Okay, so I'll show the picture. It's on slide number 14, is that right?
I think it's slide number 5.
Yes, it's right.
6.
No, but 14 in the presentation that we are using. Yeah, that's right, Leslie.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, of
So
course.
does everybody, do you see that, Maya? Is it showing up?
No, I just see the waiting room.
Okay. Yeah, that's funny how it's, okay. I'm going to give it back to you now because I took it away, so maybe it will now allow me to just give it back. GoToWebinar has decided to take over for us. I don't know. Okay. Dan, are you there? Can you take over and make yourself the presenter?
Okay, let me see.
Oh, hello. I'm reading a book. I'm trying to make a lesson.
Okay, I'm presenter. And then?
Okay, now can you give it back to Amaya, please?
Okay, hold on. Okay.
Okay, perfect. We're back.
See?
Sorry for the delay. Yep.
So
We're back with the picture, Janine.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So this is one example of one of these many controversies that flow around the issues of how should we behave within a system of care. Child caretakers are a very common phenomenon throughout the world, and for some, this is a case of children learning to be good caretakers when they become adults. For others, this is an instance of child labor, and it should be done away with as fast as possible. So next slide, please. Religion and morality. Most systems of care have some grounding in religion, and most religions concern themselves with the obligations that should obtain between human beings. For example, through precepts such as love thy neighbor as thyself, or cause no suffering and alleviate suffering whenever possible. No system of care can be separated from ideas about morality that are prevalent ideas in the society that this system belongs to. Caretaking is legitimated by religious or moral beliefs that set the parameters for what it means to be fully human in different cultural traditions. And this is a theme that frequently appears in literature and works of art. So storytelling, novels, poetry, theater, puppet theater, dramatic folk art, serious cinema. Poets and novelists write about caring with great frequency from both perspectives, that of the caretaker and that of the person being cared for. And many of the plots in literature turn around the idea that there can never be enough. For the caretaker, there can never be enough care given, but neither can there be enough rest from caretaking. And from the perspective of the receiver, and this is often the narrator or the protagonist in a work of art, there can never be enough care received, or the theme of a book is the feeling of being misunderstood by caretakers that did not provide the right kind of attention, and all of the consequences that this had for their later life. I think that literature is such a rich source of ideas and reflections of ideas about care in any society. We ought to use it much more in our studies from the social sciences and policy-making circles. Next slide, please. So, a new theme, the high demands of caretaking. This I mentioned as being one of the reasons why caretaking systems have been invisible, that I think nobody likes to remember just how demanding caretaking really is and how much anxiety it tends to produce. So we have, on the one hand, the myths about caretaking. It's easy, it involves a lot of repetitive tasks, and these are simple and they can sort of be gone through automatically with little thought. It's consistently pleasurable and fulfilling for the caretakers, and the recipients of care are cooperative and grateful. And the reality, caretaking involves many supportive and provisioning tasks that are highly demanding of creativity and strategic thinking, that keep women and men awake at night. Many tasks are painstaking and demand enormous physical strength besides patience and tolerance. And a major issue is teaching the recipients about their role and about having realistic expectations. And we're beginning to accumulate a certain literature of empirical studies of what cooking and meal preparation and meal serving means in caretaking systems. And somehow cooking and food are an entry point here, because they do seem to be a point where we can have discussions about the demands of caring and the difficulties, but also the pleasures and the outcomes and all of the ingredients and resources that go into these activities. I think the next slide is a picture, please. So this is an Amazonian indigenous village setting, and simply an illustration of the never-ending tasks in rural versions. I think that we often tend to think of caretaking as being something that is particularly complicated in urban settings, but we have to appreciate that it has its specific complications in whatever setting it occurs in. Next slide. Mental management. And this is a concept that was introduced in the earlier lecture, that's in the reading materials that all of you have seen, and enormously important. I think that in the early years of the contemporary wave of feminism, say from the 1970s on, housework was a hotly debated topic. So there were many efforts to describe it, but they usually described it through talking about discrete tasks, like cleaning the house and all that meant. And the missing ingredient was exactly what ties all of this together. What is this factor of management that somehow makes all of the parts fit together in a whole? So this is talking about functions such as planning, budgeting, administration, and quality control, and controlling a labor force which can't or won't respond to the usual incentives that we talk about in studies of other kinds of work settings. For example, children that are being asked to tidy up their clothes and toys. And I suppose we can tell them, if you don't do it, you won't get your allowance. And that is sort of standing in for the salary that the employer can withhold. But still, it's not quite the same situation or the same logic. Well, one of the very difficult, very complicated findings that comes out of looking at household tasks, caring tasks, and supportive tasks, that makes it difficult to describe these and to understand the management function, is the fact that many of these tasks go forward simultaneously. Otherwise, the day is simply not long enough. And we see this in time use surveys, where if the time is calculated for each specific task, and then the tasks are added up through the length of a day, we end up with 40-hour days or 45-hour days, and that shows just how much of this is, in fact, simultaneous activity. But once again, we run up against the moral dimension of care systems. The mental management of caring is full of tensions because the manager is constantly trying to reconcile the ideal with the real. The ideal are these standards of personalized caretaking for all the members of the group, and the real is what are the resources that this manager actually can put into play to meet these high ideals. And of course, we always fall short of what the ideals that we subscribe to. Next slide, please. Do we have
I'm sorry, it happened again. I don't know why it didn't. Can you?
Yeah, let's do it again. I'll take the...
provisioning the household. Another facet of systems of care that is systematically undervalued and underestimated in its complications, yet highly demanding, is provisioning work. This involves bringing onto the scene of care the materials, the ingredients, the technologies that caring requires. What are their sources? Jobs, social services, charities, home-based manufacturing, everything that the caretakers could imagine or imagine themselves accessing in order to facilitate the activities that they know have to be going forward in the household. So within household provisioning, we understand that the adult members of the household are responsible for this, and at the same time, if we take the hand of the social workers and home visitors, we see how frequently it is that actually accessing many of the resources that families and households need to provision themselves has to do with going through community networks and associations that act as gatekeepers and intermediaries. Persons as individuals or simple representatives of households cannot do this, but they somehow have to group together. And here again we have an empirical study in Canada that showed just how time-consuming and how important this was in the lives of women that were participating in provisioning activities for their households. I think that one of the very interesting findings of this study was showing just how often the activities in provisioning spill off into protest movements and movements for reform, so that the women's organizations that might have started out as organizations that would help their members to get through their bureaucracy and the requirements of getting access to some kind of social program, for example, end up designing a protest movement or leading a protest movement, asking for reforms, doing advocacy, and carrying on a number of activities that we would put into a category of self-defense. For example, protesting against cuts in social spending, as is taking place in many countries of the world at the present time. So I wonder there whether many of the women's organizations around the world, women's informal associations, do not have this double role of being part of the provisioning strategies of their members, but also being part of a protest movement, and a movement that eventually could lead to important reforms in the whole arena of how households provision themselves. Next slide, please. Direct caring. So we come to the heart of the matter. Direct caring and intimate relationships. And here I'm going to draw heavily on a very useful text by Viviana Zelizer, an economic sociologist. And she talks about three kinds of intimacy. And I think intimacy is a strong word. We could substitute closeness. We're talking about close relationships, some of which involve physical and hands-on contacts, which could be the hands-on care that takes place in, say, the activities that parents do for infants, or it could mean what a nurse does in a hospital setting for her patients. A second category of intimate relationships involve intimate knowledge of someone, access to their private thoughts and preferences. And I think we would all agree that taking good care of someone else requires that we know a lot about what that other person's habits are, preferences, needs, even the needs that that person is not willing to talk about. And here it's very interesting to think about the relationship, say, of parents to teenage children, where the parents are constantly trying to know more about what their teenagers are up to and what they actually need. And the teenagers are constantly trying to resist their parents' attempts to find out about who they're talking to on their cell phones and that sort of thing. And the third category is emotional and affective connections. And here, of course, we have the loving relationships that are sort of the paradigm of intimate relationships for most of us. But even so, no, emotional and affective connections can be present in a relationship such as that between a psychotherapist and the person's patient. So in general, Zelizer is trying to pull out the pieces of relationships that involve these three kinds of intimacy and trying to look in detail at exactly what this then tells us about how these relationships are managed and how much caring they involve and how that caring is expected to go forward. The other, next slide please, the other contribution that Zelizer makes in her analysis is to incorporate the law into, and this introduces us to the whole idea of sanctions. What are the mechanisms that societies use in order to ensure that once obligations for caring are somehow established through religious precepts or through social norms, what at the end of the day actually obliges people to carry out the obligations that they have? And in fact, legal systems in, I am sure, all countries of the world are very involved in issues of enforcing the norms of caretaking. Most legal systems recognize and sanction, for example, criminal negligence, or they have a concept of endangerment, or the denial of care and protection to persons for whom others are responsible. You can land in jail in many countries for denying care to persons that are legally under your responsibility. I think I'm going to move ahead a little more quickly. Zelizer also is very sensitive to issues of the evolution of caring relationships over time. These are dynamic relationships. We speak of falling into and falling out of love. How lasting will the relationships be? Do they have an endpoint? What if one of the parties dies or decides to exit the relationship? And those of you who are economists or have read Amartya Sen will recognize here his discussion of the endpoint of relationships and the exit position, or the respective positions of the members of the relationship in case there is some abrupt ending to the connection. Next slide, please. And let me just mention very quickly these 4 violations of the norms of care that are sanctioned under Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. The idea of wrong care. Care was inappropriate for the relationship. A psychotherapist overstepped the bounds of what use could be made of his or her intimate knowledge of the patient. Exploitative care. Somebody derived unfair advantages from the provision of care. Missing care. Some piece of the puzzle is missing because of negligence or the failure of care of someone else. And thankless care. And here the example that immediately springs to mind is that of the nannies and the in-home care workers that universally feel that they are underpaid, under-recognized, undercompensated for the very high levels of commitment that they show in their caretaking. Next slide, please. And once again, an example of these ambiguous situations, maybe transitional or transitory children as helpers within the household. Is this child showing us an example of exploitative care or wrong care, or something that is simply part of the socialization process and part of learning to cook and help mother and others in the household. Next slide, please. Households and helping networks. Households never stand alone in their efforts to provide themselves with care. And I think that here we have a rather abundant literature that we can rely on to understand how these helping networks extend far beyond the family. In rural societies where the entire community may be involved in relationships of exchange and mutual caretaking, newly urbanizing societies, and this is the case of shanty communities formed out of strangers and out of circumstances of need, and that in the beginning are wonderful examples of caretaking mechanisms that are invented overnight, it seems, and that are obvious that at first sight in looking at shanty communities, but that gradually disappear from the scene as the households mature and are better able to take care of their own needs for provisioning and caretaking, and the ties to neighbors become, in some cases, more an issue of conflict than of mutual support. And contemporary cities in developed countries where, again, many of the ties to neighbors and friends and even co-workers may no longer have much of a content of assistance in caretaking, but the ties that do not disappear are the ties in close family relationships, and especially the core family relationships of grandparents to children and grandchildren. Next slide, please. Norms and sanctions. Within families, the repayment of services may be delayed for decades, take various forms, may never occur. And here, the crucial factor is the time frame. Family relationships are for life. Most others have an end date. So reciprocity in most of the other relationships needs to be timely in order for it to be credible. Next slide, please. And this, I simply will recommend that you read this wonderful Korean poet, Ko-eun, who writes about a woman that within the family setting was thoroughly identified with her maternal role and had very low expectations of the assistance that she would be able to demand from other family members. And this is also a theme in writings of Amartya Sen and other economists, the factor of low expectations and low capacity for negotiation in many of the intimate relationships that we're talking about. Next slide. Our discussion would not be complete if we did not include the role of violence as a means of enforcement of some of the rules involved in the organization of care. Unfortunately, I know we can all lament that this association exists, and yet I think it's far too common that we see in the literature instances of male violence where the violence is excused or justified as a punishment for women's failure to meet expectations in relation to caretaking and commitment to the household group and to the task, all the tasks that involves. And mothers may exercise violence against children for many of the same reasons, not meeting their tasks or not performing the responsibilities that are assigned to them in the caretaking system. And this also exists in some institutional settings where caretakers may be threatened with violence, at least the violence of abruptly losing their employment. Next slide, please. Beyond the family, neighborhood, community, associations, the state. In here, norms and sanctions also apply, although they differ radically from those applied in household and family arenas. Some of them are social and moral, and this is in contexts where we are talking about local community, voluntary associations. Within institutions, and especially state institutions, we see the development of elaborate codes that seek to enforce consistency in the kinds of services they provide and that seek to prevent abuse and corruption on the part of the service providers. And once again, to our dismay, none of these mechanisms seems to be capable of completely eliminating abuses, particularly abuses that have to do with negligence and exclusion, simply not providing the care that citizens need and should have as a right. No, this is the bureaucrat that finds it very easy to simply say, you didn't fill out the form properly, so I'm sorry, there's nothing for you today. Yeah, next slide, please. Crossing cultural borders. Institutional care providers, and in particular government agencies and programs, often assume that professional credentials and expert knowledge are sufficient to persuade members of marginal communities, indigenous communities, and other minorities that the care they're providing is appropriate and is actually going to fulfill the needs of these minorities. These minorities have their own understandings of what effective care consists of and who should give it and how. And the professional degrees and expertise tend to be irrelevant in these alternative systems. The result may be care refused, resources that are not utilized, incomprehension, the persistence of marginality, and a very high degree of suspicion on the part of cultural and other minorities with respect to the state and what exactly it is trying to achieve when it offers supposed help and assistance to these minorities. Next slide. This is a notice posted at the entrance to a government health center in an indigenous community of the Peruvian Amazon. And it says, among other things, no spitting on the floor, remove your sandals or sneakers and wash your feet thoroughly if you want to get any kind of attention to your health problem here. And if you do not do so, if you do not follow these rules, you will have to clean the health post in order to get the assistance that you're requesting. If someone comes with a health emergency, I imagine all of this would be irrelevant, to say the least. Next slide. Change, evolution, and the collapse of systems of care. These are all adaptive systems, continuously changing in response to changes in the environment, economic crises, but also economic prosperity. Probably a shift to a lot of market sources of provisioning and even care, direct care services under conditions of prosperity. Demographic shifts, changing attitudes about responsibility and self-reliance. And I think that many people have observed how in rapidly urbanizing societies, the simple idea of individualism, or what goes under the code name, at least, of individualism as a value that looms ever larger in people's lives, is an example of one of these changes. People should be self-reliant, and that makes it very difficult to talk about how, in fact, all of us rely on other people and other institutions to survive daily and throughout our lives. Turbulence and rapid change is likely to increase the gender inequalities in systems of care, and turbulence always seems to increase gender inequalities. Changes in the human lifespan are an especially critical driver of change at the present moment. So children and grandparents are of special interest because of their dual role. They require care, but they also give care. Increasingly, it would seem. Next slide. My conclusions. This session has focused on the challenges of documenting and analyzing and theorizing dynamics, but I hope I have been able to show that all of these other actors have been present in the situations we have been reviewing, and I'm sure that in the sessions that are yet to come in this most stimulating course, you will be looking at all of these other actors as participants in the organization of care in greater detail. And I'd like to close there and invite your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Janine. I think right now we don't have any question. We encourage you to make your questions by typing them, in the questions box. While you do so, I wanted to ask Janine, you have been arguing that when looking at care systems, we must look at both, let's say, the social organization of care, I mean, who takes care of whom, where, in exchange for what, but also to the cultures of care, which have to do with norms, with morality, with religion, even with cultural differences. And you have also highlighted the problems, the policy implications of not taking into account these cultural differences. My question would be, do you think that we are ready and that we are even willing to take into account this cultural dimension? Because according to my point of view, I would say that we are quite biased towards that more material dimension, and that sometimes we forget about that cultural dimension. I mean, that we think that care is something that we can define instead of something that is socially defined, and that we need to understand how it's defined in its different context. So what do you think? Do you think that we are really, and even more when stressing too much the notion of the care economy, are we forgetting something about these cultural dimensions?
Thank you for that question, Amaya. I think it's so important, and it is so difficult. I mean, we can just imagine the World Bank convening a conference religious differences that we have to deal with. It's such a convenient myth that it's very hard to cross over the barrier and actually make it an important question that, or somehow show the policymakers that, well, if you operate on the assumption that ethics and morality and religious convictions are totally irrelevant in these discussions, you are in fact producing effects in the populations that are trying to get access to health programs or anti-poverty programs or anything that has to do with alleviating their needs for care and assistance. You are in fact forcing them to do what the Amazonian indigenous people have to do when they try to go to the house post. If they can't wash their feet and take off their sandals and somehow make themselves presentable or turn themselves into the proper client for these services, the sort of typical urban style of client, then they just can't get the services. So then we have the persistent issues of social marginality and unstoppable poverty and religious conflicts and cultural conflicts, and they will just be never ending. I think that the questions are difficult, but maybe particularly those of us that come from gender studies or women's studies, I mean, the ethics of care is an issue that's been worked on by many feminist philosophers with many interesting answers and solutions. And maybe it's something that we are especially called upon to bring to the table.
Thank you, Janine. We have one question by Benedetta Magri. She asks, how can we give value to care in cultural ethical terms without risking to reconfine it in the unpaid and valued sphere? Janine, did you listen to my question, or maybe I will repeat it, okay? We have a question by Benedetta.
Sorry, I think I was...
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can hear me now. My immediate thought would be, okay, bring into the discussion the issues of cultural differences, morality, religious convictions that somehow impinge on caretaking systems, but don't leave out all that we have built and learned about the economics of caretaking and about the policies and the massive needs for care. Now, somehow find ways to integrate these discussions into a single stream where each of the elements we would recognize where difference and specificities have to be made possible. Options have to be made possible for people. And the high costs have to be paid for allowing these options and choices to go forward. Choices about, say, child care systems or even health services. But we don't lose sight of all that we've learned about the materiality of care as well.
Yes, the same participant, Benedetta, was specifying her question, saying, I mean, in feminist terms, we should try to rediscuss the general paradigm of what is valuable. What do you think, Janine?
I am totally in agreement. I think that the feminists also feel a lot of nervousness when we confront cultural differences in definitions of value, and it's an idea that has been present in feminist debates from the beginning, and yet, to confront it head on, we need a whole lot more time and maybe studies, empirical studies that would help us to understand, well, just how far are we all from consensus on certain values and certain understandings of value.
I think we don't have any other question. I encourage you to ask Janine anything you might want to know about from her. But I will add one question, Janine, because I think maybe it's something that we don't discuss that frequently when dealing with care. What about violence? Could you please go into a bit more detail about violence, and especially maybe related to that ethics of care that you were saying? Because when we think about care, mostly we think about love, about reciprocity, about, caring relationships, but violence is also there, isn't it?
Yeah, this is another topic that turns out to be makes us very nervous, I think. The idea that somehow there should be force involved in actually making persons meet their obligations with respect to caring for another person. I don't know whether, certainly wife beating or even feminicide in cases of husbands and partners that assassinate a woman and they try to excuse it by saying, well, my food wasn't hot, or my food wasn't ready, or she wasn't a proper mother, or her behavior was somehow bringing dishonor on my household unit, and I was forced to take that violent action against her. We can all recognize that this is a total abuse of violence and force in a relationship that that somehow involved or was part of the whole system of caretaking. One of the pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to put on the table. But is it an example of violence, for example, when a court of law mandates that a daughter is legally responsible for caring for her elderly parents, even though her own life project is something entirely different, even though there may be somebody else that could take on this responsibility, even though neither she nor the parents have a relationship of affection anymore. That was somehow lost along the way. And for her to be forced or obligated under threat of fines or jail or whatever a legal system might use to do caretaking. I mean, is this an abuse of or an excess of the capacity of using force and violence to enforce norms of caretaking? I think that there's a whole arena there where we, again, need to have a number of very serious discussions. Stop looking only to these extreme cases of wife beaters and wife assassins, and start looking more at coercion and even the moral coercion that oftentimes is involved in enforcing these norms of caretaking. And I guess just in general, try to be a little more realistic. Talk to many more women about what role this idea of the threat of violence, if not the actual practice, just where that lies in their own thinking about the way they do caretaking and the reasons for taking care in the way they do.
We don't have any other question by participants, so I will make a last question. In case you have any, just type it. I insist on that. Janine, in this course, we argue that we should advance towards the right to care and towards co-responsibility, and that the whole society should be responsible for that, but specifically public institutions and the state. So how can these public institutions answer to things that you were talking about, such as flexibility, the need that care arrangements must be flexible in order to answer both to predictable care needs? For example, when we say that population is aging and we can predict that now, so we should be prepared for that. But also there are a lot of unpredictable things that may happen, so we need to be flexible. At the same time, we need to be aware of cultural differences and different norms and different moralities. How can public institutions and policies, care policies, how can they deal with all this diversity and flexibility? Do you think it is possible?
I think it is possible, although this will never be a process that's entirely free of conflict. I mean, living with conflict and debates and differences is just part of human life. I suppose I take that as a starting principle. But I would certainly, I mean, we know that there's a massive tendency in modern, massive, bureaucratic societies where governments are effectively setting a major part of the parameters for how the caretaking system is going to work, that most of the people that have access to the decisions are not the women and men and caretakers on the ground. Certainly not the child caretakers or the grandparent caretakers and care recipients. So we know that there has to be much more involvement of those actors in the whole process of formulating caretaking policies and administering and managing and doing all of the constant correction, of course, that has to go on in agencies that are trying to articulate with changing populations and changing needs in those populations. So the idea that, I mean, we would have to imagine that someone like the mother and housewife, in scare quotes, that our Korean poet describes, a woman that's really unable to speak to power about even the power of her sons and her husband, to speak about the injustices she feels that she has had to live through as part of her caretaking responsibilities, her role in life. No, the difficulty of putting into words the problems that caretakers diagnose. No, somehow this idea of looking to community-level women's organizations and the kinds of reforms and demands, when women group together and speak out of numbers, it's no longer the individual, it's now the group, and the possibilities of groups and voluntary associations to go to battle for the rights of their members and others like them. I would certainly hope that that kind of actor and that kind of organization could become ever more present in the policy debates around caretaking.
Thank you, Janine. We have another question from Benedetta. She asks another question about care systems. Have you noticed a relationship between the value given to institutionalized care and a lower value to individual and intra-household care? There is, for instance, a lot of debate as to whether migrant women in Nordic countries have the right to keep their children away from early child care. What do you think?
Boy, this is one of the really burning issues in the whole question of cultural differences, because, of course, young children are the learners of the care system that corresponds to their own society, and most parents are very protective of the kinds of learning experiences that very young children have. I think that we understand that somehow older children can recognize issues of difference and different perspectives and understand exactly where they are positioned in this, in a scenario of a lot of discrepancies and contradictions. But young children are not as well positioned to defend themselves against different notions of how their care and education should proceed. So I'm not sure at this moment. I would need to think a lot more about how I would connect that to the larger issue of values. But certainly the issue of young children's induction into certain styles and understandings about care, and the sometimes force. I mean, going to preschool in some societies is an issue of obligation. Parents must send their children to preschool, as they must send them to whatever is the obligatory number of years of basic public education. So there too, all I can imagine is that somehow we have to have clear debates about what's going on here, about what from the policymakers' perspective is a totally benign effort to assist migrant families or poor families or marginal families and somehow alleviate the caretaking responsibilities. But from the perspective of the families, this is an invasion of their right to teach young children their own understandings of what their experiences should be at that stage of life. I hope I've been able to do some to the question, which I find very interesting, very important.
Okay, we do not have any other question. Benedetta was saying thank you. These ideas are very interesting. I really think they are very interesting, and they provide a new perspective on the topics that we are dealing with during this course. So thanks very, very much, Janine, for your time together with us. And just a final things for the participants in the course. Remember that this online lecture and also the question and answer session will be available on the platform, on the website, under the section for week 2 and under the blog on online lectures, although it will take a couple of days to upload the recordings. And please remember also that our next online lecture, the third one, will be with Sara Razavi on global variations in the political and social economy of care, next Monday at the same time, 9 a.m. EST. And while we wait for this online lecture, we can also meet in the platform, the discussion forum, or even through the email or any other way. So Janine, thank you very much. We will keep you updated on the performance of the course and hope to meet you again soon. Remember that you can ask any of us the different questions regarding to the course. And thank you all. I think we've been together for more than an hour, and that's enough for today. So have a good day to everyone, and thank you. Bye.